Looking at a work of op art does something to you. Consider for a moment Victor Vasarely's serograph Omega 5. As you allow your eyes to wander, scanning the red, green, and blue cubes, the photoreceptors in your eyes are hard at work, detecting not only color and fine detail, but value, depthless shadows and gleaming highlights. The combination of vivid hues, geometric distortion, and repetition creates an illusion of depth and movement. A swelling oblong sphere emerges, pulsing. Look a little longer, and the sphere appears to breathe. You might begin to feel amused, unsettled, confused, even sick. Don't adjust your screen. This is your brain on op art. Hi, I'm Sarah Churchill, the Adjunct Instructor of Art History here at Housatonic Community College. Join me as we consider some key works from the permanent collection of the Housatonic Museum of Art in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Today, we'll be looking at optical art, or op art, a short-lived yet innovative global offshoot of kineticism which dominated the mid-1960s. Drawing inspiration from a long tradition of illusionism in art history, and from a wave of atomic-era technological innovation, artists like Victor Vasarely, Josef Albers, Bridget Riley, Richard Anuszkiewicz all unsettled the art world. Their art, quite simply, refused to sit still and behave. Consumed by the nature of optical effects in visual art, the op artists rejected the angst and obsessive individualism that defined their predecessors, the abstract expressionists. Embracing repetition and automation, anonymity and austerity, op art instead spoke to a new era of post-war optimism and a positivist attitude to progress and technology. Using static compositions and unresolvable visual tension, op artists preyed on the fallibility of human vision, generating the perception of movement and depth. The work was both astonishing and playful, yet it could also be equally nightmarish, its darker, more unsettling impulses conflicting with the more egalitarian and promising technophilic impulses of the age. Op art was one of several movements competing to become the new avant-garde. Debate centered around not only artistic practice and aesthetics, but on the relationship between the artist, the work, and the viewer. American art critics Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried championed post-painterly abstraction, or color field painting, a purely optical experience meant to be appreciated with dispassionate detachment. Greenberg's rival Harold Rosenberg emphasized artistic process, promoting the neo-Dada assemblages of Robert Rauschenberg and the happenings of performance artists like Alan Capro. By contrast, MoMA curator William Seitz prioritized the viewer response over either the work itself or the actions of its creator. In The Responsive Eye, an international survey of more than 100 works of perceptual abstraction, Seitz repositioned the spectator from the negligible periphery to the nucleus of artistic production. With op art, the viewer participates in the work's creation. Their visual perception, in effect, completes the piece. The Responsive Eye, according to Seitz, dramatized the power of static forms and colors to stimulate dynamic psychological responses. This supposed new tendency in art was a movement which reckoned with emerging Gestalt approaches to human perception and with vision itself as a unifying design principle. Exploiting the eye's struggle to process compositions of hard-edged, geometric abstraction, op artists explored contradictory attitudes to the relationship between art and reason. Theirs was a polemic that had been foregrounded particularly at the brief but influential German art school known as the Bauhaus, and by constructivism, a modern art movement rooted in functional design and truth to materials. The Bauhaus, born during the German Weimar Republic in 1919, radically reimagined art and design education, marrying the late 19th century nostalgia for craft with modern European industrialization. Under the leadership of critical figures like Vasily Kandinsky, Johannes Itten, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, artistic production became cross-pollinated with emerging theories of psychology and economics. In its philosophical embrace of both the industrial and natural material worlds, the Bauhaus unified competing strains of art and technology. Moholy-Nagy and his contemporary Josef Albers centered vision in their pedagogy, and believed themselves to be producing a new type of designer with specialized training in science and craft technique. Under their guidance, a new generation of artists began to see art as a valid method of scientific inquiry, in which invention was fundamental to artistic production. While commercially successful, op art critics argued that it was too facile and decorative to have deeper meaning. However, the responsive eye exemplified the most pregnant discourses of the atomic age, responding with both fear and fascination to recent advancements in nuclear energy, aerospace, computer science, and film. Much like the invention of scientific perspective during the Renaissance, or the Impressionist investigations of color theory, the emergent dominance of modern photography, it was argued, significantly informed 20th century perception. Consequently, the arts were rapidly being rethought according to new ways of seeing and being in the world. Abstract films like Marcel Duchamp's anemic cinema, for example, imagined new, purely formal languages of rhythmic, geometric abstraction, while concepts of design practice codified at the Bauhaus guided mid-century explorations in painting, collage, design, and architecture across Europe and the Americas. In seriality, simplicity, and repetition, op artists founded a universal visual syntax with utopian potentiality. Of all of art's formal elements, color was the most profound and most magical for Josef Albers. In ISE, Homage to a Square, Variant 2, we see not a square, but a series of nesting rectangles in mustard, cream, gray, green, and turquoise. Playing with the scale of simple geometric forms, Variant 2 delights in subtle washes of gray and gold that modulate the colors beneath. The compositional motif, which features two small, slender rectangles framed within concentric fields of contrasting colors, follows from Albers' observations of adobe, or mud brick houses, seen and photographed during his many trips to Mexico and the American Southwest. The Variant series inspired his most famous collection of paintings and prints, Homage to the Square, a theme he explored until his death in 1976. The pre-Columbian impulse toward abstraction resonated powerfully with Albers. Beginning in 1935, Albers and his wife, textile artist Ani Albers, traveled to Mexico over a dozen times, visiting and documenting major archaeological sites like Chichen Itza and Monte Alban. Inspired by the geometric simplicity and colors of Mexican and pre-Columbian architecture, Albers produced richly chromatic paintings and prints that reflected his admiration of their craft. "Mexico is truly the promised land of abstract art," he wrote, "for here it is already thousands of years old." Never before, and certainly not since, has the humble square had such an impact on the history of modern art. Born and raised in Germany, Albers joined the Bauhaus in 1920, first as a student and later as a professor, expanding his working interests from glass to furniture design and typography. Following the dissolution of the Bauhaus and the rise of National Socialism in Germany, Josef and Ani fled to America, where their presence at the Black Mountain College and at Yale ensured that the reach of the Bauhaus would be global. The intensity with which Albers pursued the phenomenology of color had profound effects on art and design pedagogy. He not only created the first course in color theory based exclusively on the direct observation of color's behavior, he also drafted the most comprehensive theoretical analysis of color in the 20th century, the influential Interaction of Color, now in its 4th edition. His philosophies and teaching touched countless artists, including Elaine de Kooning, Ruth Atzawa, Cy Twombly, and Kenneth Noland. Robert Rauschenberg considered him the most important teacher he'd ever had. While Albers was among the best-known masters of perceptual abstraction, he was overlooked by contemporaries as too modish. However, it would be impossible to imagine the op art movement without Albers at its theoretical core. His repetition of standardized forms, systematic organization, and fascination with the optical and with psychophysical effects of color in painting and printmaking became critical facets of op art experimentation. Educated at a Bauhausian-style private academy in Budapest, Victor Vasarely's lifelong fascination with vision, illusionism, and economy of design was evident even among his earliest works as a graphic designer in Paris in the 1930s. Inspired by domestic design and architecture, Vasarely recognized that geometric patterns and forms could be exploited to create the impression of depth in the two-dimensional picture plane. Moving towards the fine arts, he eventually co-founded the Galerie Denis René, which became an important center for op art in mainland Europe. The gallery's 1955 exhibition, Le Mouvement, accompanied by Vasarely's signature text, The Yellow Manifesto, baptized kineticism and launched Vasarely's reputation as op art's founding father. Unlike the mobiles or frenetic assemblages of his contemporaries Alexander Calder and Jean Tinguely, Vasarely recognized that literal motion was not a prerequisite of kineticism. Instead, he attempted to simulate sustained movement by manipulating the eye's natural tendency to make sense of abstraction. He turned to the newly popular principles of Gestalt psychology, a 20th century school of thought grounded in the science of perception. Vasarely's faith in science and technology inspired him to radically reimagine techniques of perspective and distortion exploited by painters since the Renaissance. Seeing in op art a universal, repeatable, and democratic language, he boldly declared the end of easel painting and the beginning of art for all. In declaring that the creative act could be both programmable and scientific, he proclaimed that clarity, objectivity, and order would fulfill the post-traumatic needs of mid-century optimism. Part of Vasarely's third significant body of work, known as the Gestalt series, the intense Itso Rouge presents the viewer with a visual riddle that refuses resolution. As your eyes scan the print's surface, your brain is working hard, observing small, tessellated squares of varying chromatic intensity and value, and imagining planes in depth where there is essentially none. The strategic arrangement of light and dark squares creates the impression of highlights and shadows from which a tangled mass emerges. Huge and red, the resultant form is mysteriously weightless, and yet solid and imposing, safely contained, and yet indeterminable. Much like his mentor, Josef Albers, Richard Anuszkiewicz built his career exploring the experience of color, focusing particularly on the ways in which color's behavior is largely dictated by its context. Take, for example, the serigraph sequential 10, which features a pair of slender rectangles constituted by bright, vibrating, laser-like lines that appear to advance and recede. One of several plates in the sequential portfolio series, 10 plays with color temperatures and with the phenomena of simultaneous contrast, a psychophysiological effect following from the interaction between colors of different saturations and hues. When placed side by side, the color in greater quantity influences the eye's perception of the other. In this instance, the cool cobalt in 10 is modulated by two very similar but nonetheless different reds. Look closely and you'll note that the blue appears darker and muddier next to lines of a warm cherry red and cooler and cleaner opposite lines of magenta. While the juxtaposition of magenta and cobalt is more harmonious, the combination of red and blue creates a struggle for chromatic dominance. This is because the richly saturated red is creating a negative afterimage. As the cones in your eyes tire, almost imperceptible green stripes emerge, altering the adjacent blue and making it look muddy and desaturated. The radiating lines in sequential 10 have a hypnotic quality that is characteristic of Anuszkiewicz's body of work, reflecting his desire to create something romantic and contemplative out of what might otherwise appear sterile and mechanical. Dubbed by the New York Times as a wizard of op, Anuszkiewicz's career was as marked by obsessive precision as it was a compulsion for color. While much of his early education was steeped in the regionalism and social realism of his native Midwest, Anuszkiewicz was drawn to study at Yale, where he absorbed Albers' influential color theory and propensity for modular forms and rectilinearity. Steeped in Impressionism, yet driven by technical virtuosity and minimalism, Anuszkiewicz's colorful geometric abstraction rectified the spiritual against the rational to stunning effect. An overlooked figure in the legacy of op art, Joseph Levi has, throughout his career, created works that confront the act of looking at art and challenge the idea of visual permanence. After graduating from the Fine Arts Department at University of Connecticut, Levi spent several years in the United States Army and its reserves, while also studying art history at Columbia University. His first mature body of work, which emerged in the mid-1960s at the height of op art's popularity, was abstract and is represented here in light constructions like Eromanga and Periapt, and in the serigraphs that followed, like XWZCB. Levi's light constructions were exhibited at Eleanor Ward's Stable Gallery in 1966, a venue renowned for its bold and innovative curation. Periapt, a term which means charm or amulet, imbues industrial materials like formica, wire mesh, and fluorescent lighting with their own kind of modern technological magic. Like a conjurer, Levi masterfully fools the eye into seeing shapes and patterns that reveal themselves only when one stands at the proper vantage point. When illuminated, Periapt produces the illusion of 4 small white circles, each of which is suspended within a white square of equal size. Black polka dots, large and small, swim in and out of focus, forming patterns that delineate shape and generate the impression of buoyancy and transience. The illusion is repeated with Eromanga, but with a single circle of a brilliant cobalt. Up close, the trick is revealed to be little more than the artful juxtaposition of double layers of perforated wire mesh. This technique produces what is known as a moire effect, a visual interference generated by the juxtaposition of 2 slightly misaligned grids laid one over the other. This moire pattern produces a hologram magnifying patterns and shapes to various strengths. Elegant in simplicity, both Periapt and Eromanga prioritize the experience of the viewer over formal aesthetics. Each animates the environment around it by commanding the movement and participation of a willing audience. Levi's subject here is not so much the work of art itself, but sight and the seemingly miraculous transformation of light in response to mundane materials. Visually speaking, Henry Pearson's work stands solidly among the best within the perceptual art tradition. But theoretically, Pearson diverged markedly from his contemporaries, being more interested in culture, poetry, literature, and drama than in science or technology. Trained initially as a set designer, Pearson came to fine art in the mid-1950s. While his black on white was included in MoMA's blockbuster, The Responsive Eye, Pearson himself rejected the op art label, arguing that his work was more romantic than the movement against which he was so often compared. Nonetheless, Pearson, much like Vasarely, found inspiration in the suprematism of Russian painter Kazimir Malevich, who shared Pearson's fascination with the bird's eye view in aerial photography. In New York, Pearson studied at the Art Students League under Reginald Marsh and Will Barnett, where he became a fixture among the New York abstraction scene. Expanding Yellow, a striking expanse of lemon and gold, precedes Pearson's progression towards the undulating parallel lines for which he would become known, and reflects the influence of hard-edged painting. In Pearson's massive and severe architectonic forms, we can begin to see his interest in playing with aerial perspective and topography. However, the flatness of Expanding Yellow and its absence of figuration and emotion heightens the viewer's awareness of the canvas as an object, refuting the illusionism that characterized so many within the op art movement. Through this new experimental language, adherents to the op art movement imagined a world in which progress was not only possible, but inevitable. But in the end, the movement was the victim of its own success. The commercial embrace of The Responsive Eye, one of the first blockbusters in contemporary art, proved to be the kiss of death. Luxury department stores, textile designers, and fashion magazines like Vogue crassly commercialized op art techniques as mindless mirth, emptying the movement of its theoretical significance. Meanwhile, the failure of the May '68 student protests in France, the murder of Martin Luther King in America, and the ongoing conflict in Vietnam eroded the optimism that had buoyed the post-war generation. As the bubble burst, taste for the psychedelic effects of color and form waned. Op art became kitsch, synonymous with the spirit of the swinging 60s. However, critically acclaimed retrospectives have, in recent years, revised op art's unfortunate underestimation. Its visionary spirit and fearless experimentation are today celebrated for helping to clear the path for post-minimalism's break with conventional painting and sculpture. Thank you for joining me today at the Housatonic Museum of Art. If you've enjoyed your tour of op art, I'm certain you'll want to see the rest of our permanent collection, on display throughout the campus, as well as our special exhibitions in the Burt Chernow galleries. For more information, please visit www.housatonicmuseum.org.